Hi, everybody. All right. I know I came on unannounced, and that's okay. Everybody can watch the recording. Anybody who wants to look at this information can watch the recording. Okay. So I came on the other day talking about my husband's family history and my experiences in the research of this family. And I did write a book, actually, believe it or not. I started writing a book, and it's on Wattpad, but I have not finished it. I think it's because I wanted to um, kind of redo it over again because it really needed some work. All right. So I have come to the conclusion that after discussing the other day, what I discussed was the discrepancies in the names, the different settlers named John Hord, John Hurd, and so on. So today I'm going to discuss, believe it or not, I'm going to discuss the boat ride. I figured I would go with that route. So looking into the records, I am still looking at records that are pertaining to somewhere in around Lincolnshire because obviously Anne and William Hutchinson were from Alford, Lincolnshire, England. That's where they were lit. That's where they were born, raised, and so on. Now, Alford, Lincolnshire, excuse me, Lincolnshire, England would be a little bit far away from Somersetshire, England. But what I gleaned from some of this is that obviously William and Anne were married in London, and I think William was a merchant. So there's no problem there that they probably had connected somehow, some way, to get this um, apprenticeship or what they call indentured servanthood contract drawn up. According to some of the records that I found, if I go by this family out of Somersetshire, which I'm going to do for now until I find something else, um, the father of John Hurd or Hord would have died in 1624. I'm going to put on the PowerPoint, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over quickly the family history that I know of, and then I'll go into the ship because I think that will work better. And I will change the description of this live. All right. So John and Mary Hurd, I just kind of made a picture here of Plymouth, but I'd say Boston looked very similar to this maybe in 1634. Might have been a little bit more advanced, but with homes and stuff. But we'll just go with this since it's a cute picture of some settlers. All right. So John Hord pedigree, or John Hurd. All right. Somehow, some way, he pronounced it that way. Okay. So about 1612, he was born in England, possibly in Higham, Somerset, England. The ancestry of this family, as spelled out in the book The Horde, states that the family started with George Horde, Hourde, in Kingstown, Somerset, England, and it is unknown who he married, but he had issue. And I'm going to say that the year he was around was 14 in the 1400s. He had a son named Thomas Hurd. He was born 1520, died 1575, married a woman named Margeria Briery, unknown father, mother, unknown date, but married October 13th, 1541. Now that was in the records in the church. They had two sons. One's name was Johannes or John. The other one was George. All right. Hurd. And also there might have been a William in there, but I didn't see a birth record for a William Hord, Hourde, because there is a William Howard born around that same time period and settled in Elliston. So it might be a different family. But that was the other family I was talking about that settled in Connecticut. So we're talking about this family who would go by Hurd or Hurd. All right. So Johannes married a woman named Miriam or Maria or Mary Rod, June 25th, 1577, and Mary was a daughter of Henry Rod. Now, the reason why I picked this line also is because of the initials that John Hord used on his will. His initials were John F. H. Hord. So he could have been Henry as one of his middle names. So Johannes and Mary had many children. And they had one John, or Johns at the time, that's how they spelled it. But he died at birth. And then Anthony was born in 1579. Adrian was born in 1581. And Johannes, or John, was born in 1588. Among other children. Now, John's, Hurde, if you notice how they spell the last name, married a Christina Wilcox. And they had an issue. And I think they married in 1613 or 1612, one of those two dates. They had issue, John Hord, Hurde, August 1619 or September of 1612, 1612. He baptized in September of 1612, beginning. He died September 25th, 1690 in Boston, Massachusetts. Okay, so that is it for the family line. So uncovering the records. So all the children's records in Boston Church have been spelt their surname Hurde, which is pronounced Hord. The immigration record spells his surname in many ways, which I went over the other day. John Hord spelt his surname Hord. He was a well-known tailor, and he came on the ship, the Griffin, as an indentured servant under William Hutchinson, who was a cloth merchant, and John was released from the servanthood in 1638, shortly after the Hutchinsons were exiled for Anne's heretic ideas. All right, so I will skip over this for a minute, and we're going to go into the Griffin. They came on the Griffin ship. They arrived in Boston Port on September 18th, 1634. So John, being an indentured servant under William Hutchinson, accompanied him and his wife on the ship, Anne and their children. Even though the passenger list mentions about 30 names, the record states there is at least 100 people on board, along with cattle. And you can just imagine the stench on the ship from the cattle, and the feces and everything, and the animals, and the hay and everything they had to put on that ship, and the stench, the illnesses, and the unsanitary conditions involved. This trip was about maybe 1 or 2 months long. The trip might have had Mary, who became John's wife in 1638, as well on board, as probably a nurse under Anne Hutchinson, who was a midwife, and I mentioned that the last video. She probably nursed many to health on board, and the lack of food and sanitation would make anyone sick. Any of the settlers on the ships, including they had many stories about the pilgrims, the sickness that was on the ships at the time due to lack of sanitation, lack of food, lack of temperatures, They got illnesses on the ocean. Many people died on the ship. Now, it doesn't say that the beginning of their voyage, they might have had more people on the list. Most of the time, when people died on the ship, they just put down on the thing deceased, and they basically put did a little prayer and threw the bodies overboard. All right, so unfortunately, they had to do that because if not, you were going to have dead bodies on the ship. And that wouldn't have been good either. So they would have just said died at sea, you know, but they would be record on there when they died, what date, all that kind of thing. They kept track of calendar, of course. All right, so the possibility of them hitting major storms, hurricanes, or anything else. Now, this is during the summer, so any thunder showers, heavy surf, waves, the very dangerous trip. So these people were very, very brave. Okay, so the description of William from John Winthrop, who was the original settler in Boston, described him as a mild-tempered man and somewhat weak, living under the shadow of his prominent and outspoken wife. Now, Anne was known to have teachings, the Bible, and the Bible studies all the time. And she was very outspoken about her religious faith and questioned the Puritans a lot about their teachings and the way they did things. And that got her in trouble. So I have an article that I found online, and I'm actually going to pull it up on my iPad so I can read it from my iPad, because on this thing it's not very good. It says, the immediate inspirer of the Puritan exodus from England was Archbishop Laud, who had a cheerful habit of cutting off the ears of people who differed with him concerning the unknowable. The Puritans were people who believed in religious liberty. They rebelled from ritual form, pomp, and parade and sacred things. Their clergy were ministers. Their churches were meeting houses and communicants and congregation. Boston settlers were Congregationalists and stood about halfway between Presbyterianism and the Independents. Oliver Cromwell, it will be remembered, was an independent. John Winthrop was a man very much like him, a Congregationalist or Puritan. The Griffin carried over 100 passengers, among them 2 clergymen who were known to fame simply because they crossed the sea with Anne Hutchinson. These men were Reverend John Lathrop and Reverend Zacharias Sims. Religious devotions occupied a goodly portion of the Puritan time, both on the ship and on shore. The 2 clergymen on the Griffin very naturally took charge of the spiritual affairs on the craft. The apportioned out of the time best suited them. There were prayers in the morning, prayers in the evening, preaching at forenoon, prayers and singing psalms between times. Mrs. Hutchinson was a physician by natural endowment and made it her special business to look after the physical welfare of the women and children on the ship. This was well, but when she called the meeting of all the women on the board the ship and addressed them, and Reverend John Lathrop and Reverend Zacharias Sims invited themselves to attend in order to see what manner the meeting might be. All went well, but in a week Mrs. Hutchinson kind of got on the nerves of the reverend gentleman. Both men were strictly Class B. They were stern, severe, sober, serious, sincere, very sincere. Mrs. Hutchinson was practical, rapid, witty, and ready in speech. They were obtuse and profound. Of course, they argued, for all the parties were Puritans. Daily disputes were indulged in about the meaning of misty passages in the biblical lore. The ministers attended Mrs. Hutchinson's meetings, and she attended theirs. They criticized her teachings, and she made bold to say a few words about their sermons. And the passengers, having nothing better to do, took sides. So you can just imagine the interesting conversations that went on in that ship. All right. So when the land was sighted, and and at last the Griffin passed slowly through the mouth of the harbor, all disputes were forgotten, and joyous service of thanksgiving was held. I say all disputes were forgotten. Two men, however, remembered. These men were Reverend John Lathrop and Reverend Zacchaeus Sims. They felt hurt, grieved, injured. The woman had usurped their place and besprinkled their sacred office with disrespect. At least they thought so. An anchor was dropped, and they were among the first to clamber over the side and pull for the shore. They sought out John Winthrop, governor of the colony, and told him to beware of that Hutchinson woman. She had a tongue that was double-edged. John Winthrop smiled and guessed that a woman with 15 children could not help but be a blessing to the colony. And the two ministers drew long Puritan visages and thought otherwise. So she was very outspoken about her faith. And what they were telling us, and when she did settle, when they finally had everything settled, she said she was witty and the church, bold in spirit. She was holding Bible meetings or studies at her home, and she often criticized the teachings of the Puritan church. That got her in massive trouble and ended up getting them exiled in 1838. So you can just imagine what John and even Mary went through those 4 years, all right, underneath his servanthood with Anne and William. It seems that the way I saw it, or the way I read about other voyages, they were a little bit different, but this one must have been a very interesting would have liked to have been a fly on the wall in that boat. Right? Because I can imagine how anointed this woman was by the Holy Spirit to call these teachers, who supposedly are preachers, out on things that didn't either match the teachings of the Bible, or she interpreted them different than they did. But she was all for religious freedom, and she felt it was right, and she was highly influenced by John Cotton, who actually arrived in Boston the year before her on the same ship as her son. So being underneath servanthood of William Hutchinson must have been something, because William Hutchinson also became like a involved in leadership in Boston and was a merchant. So he had a good reputation among the men. So when he freed John, which they said they were exiled. Some say they were exiled in March of 1838. Some say it was April. but I think the compact in Rhode Island was signed in March of 1838. John married Mary sometime in October of 1838. I will go over indentured servitude the next time I come on. I'll talk about that and why he didn't marry earlier. And maybe I'll go into a little bit of the practices over there, how their practices were for marriage and courting, or courting and marriage. It's quite interesting. Anyway, that's all I have today. And I hope you guys find this a little interesting, a little tidbit about this woman, Anne Hutchinson, who put a big mark in Boston's history. It's quite interesting that my husband's ancestors, his great 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 grandfather, 10 generations back, worked underneath them. And Mary probably did too, because it said in this article that Anne was a physician by natural endowment, and Mary was a nurse, and she didn't have much for education. So to work underneath Mrs. Hutchinson to learn how to take care of people, a nurse, it was a big possibility that he met her on the ship, or even before the ship. Very good friends. They were very good friends and they got along very well. And when it came time for him to want to marry, he picked her and she picked him. So, interesting. Well, anyway, until next time, bye. God bless you all.